welcome to Varn Vlog. And today I'm here with Max Seijo, formerly of the Superstructure podcast of More Money on the Left, but now liberated from such things. And we're here to talk about the perils of academia, critical humanities in academia, and maybe even the limits of trying to popularize that discourse. So I'm going to start this off like I would an AA meeting almost. How did you end up an ex-academic?
Oh, that's a long story, Derick. Well, I'm happy to be back. Thanks for having me back on the show. Perhaps I guess a good place to start is maybe to talk about the two strikes, both of different nature at the UCs. One with UAW and one without UAW that sort of bookended my time in graduate school. And so one of them was the cost of living adjustment strike, which was a wildcat strike right before COVID, that COVID ended. And then the last one was the official UAW grad student postdoc and researchers strike that achieved, let's just say, a contract that certainly was not in line with not even the bleeding edge of the rank and file, but the kind of big middle of what the rank and file wanted, and only was achieved through giving perks to the bigger campuses, which is a long story. And there are other people who could tell that story perhaps better than I could. But these two events, I think, really colored my view of the way that graduate school, academic labor, and ideas kind of intersect and potentially obfuscate the kind of structural dynamics at the heart of these intellectual endeavors that certainly most think are the main goal of entering and maintaining a career in academia.
Okay, so your disillusionment is different than mine. I am also an ex-academic, although I quit twice. I quit once after I finished my MFA and became a public school teacher, and then I quit again after becoming a lecturer at a university in South Korea for several years, and dealing with a lot of PhDs from Ivy League schools and being frankly underimpressed with them. But one of the things that got me out the first time is actually very similar to yours. I worked in Georgia. People may or may not know public sector unions are effectively illegal in Georgia. You can form associations, not unions. You cannot strike. You cannot do collective bargaining, etc. And we tried to, before it was cool and the bleeding edge of academic labor, form a union, and we were very quickly informed that that was illegal and that we would be kicked out immediately upon doing so, and probably even prosecuted. So we immediately dropped that, and I worked as an adjunct and for a little while. And as an adjunct, I made less than minimum wage, actually, when I figured hours worked, because we were contracted per class at this time around $1,500 per class, and you could only really get 3 or 4. So if you put together multiple schools, you could maybe make $16,000-$17,000 a year. You know, you could beat the absurdly low U.S. poverty line of $14,000 a year, which is, by the way, you have to make less than minimum wage to be under the poverty line in the United States. You could beat that if you worked at 2 or 3 schools. And so that had no appeal to me, particularly with this pressures of also trying to publish on top of that, to be able to get out of that situation and being told if I stayed in that situation too long, it would be assumed that I was happy with that, and thus would be stuck in it because, you know, you are doing this for some kind of altruistic reason, usually because you come from money and you just want to teach. That scenario quickly led me to, wow, there's something fundamentally fucked up about this. And my institution went from undergrads being taught primarily by full associate or assistant professors to undergrads being taught primarily by TAs in the time period I was there. So I could see how this was happening downstream from the major institutions, which arguably had to do it because of their class size.
Yeah, it's funny. It's interesting to hear you talk about like the particular form of your experience, because I feel like becoming disillusioned from academia is something, it's like there are many different paths to that outcome. Many different forks and cul-de-sacs one can find themselves on at different moments in time in their career slash, I mean, it's hard to call it a career for some of the symptomatic reasons, I think, that we'll get to. But and it the stuff you're talking about is interesting, because I think certainly before my time, where the dynamics that you're describing kind of had already come into fruition, um, and these shifts, whether it's at smaller, medium-sized institutions or some of the larger institutions that I did my PhD in, well, never completed, but started and did about more than half of my PhD in. These dynamics where grad student labor becomes kind of the crux of, particularly in the humanities, of the contact between students and the university, is something that I think any grad student now would kind of just assume and like recognize as just the status quo. Whether it's TAs taking on grading workload, or teaching workload, or just generally being the kind of primary contact between students and their classes. It's funny to hear you say that, because to me, that was one of the kind of the last of my worries. Certainly there was a lot of work that went into that sort of work, but that was something that I always felt like it was more grounded in what the actual purpose of the institution was than some of the other aspects of the research side, and the way that the contemporary academic job market, particularly in the humanities, really skews incentives to, I mean, this is something we were talking about both on Twitter and then offline in DMs, to create this striving for newness and for a form of brand management as ultimately the goal, because the only way to get hired is to be loud, or to get lucky and to ride a wave, and to appeal to a certain sense of novelty that will allow some boxes to be checked, whether it's by deans or administration, or even inside departments themselves, which are trying to position themselves or sell themselves as a particular thing that deserves to be funded for a particular reason. And this is something that, you know, you find across the board in many different disciplines, many different departments, many different universities. You know, I have my particular experience. You do as well. If you're on Twitter, you find this sort of thing all over the kind of public scholarship space, precisely because, and it's a really unfortunate situation, but the precarity at the heart of the funding model is really polluted the general approach, I think, that many people take to the work. And it's something that it's difficult to get around. You know, I'm speaking from my experience, and I'm implicated in this experience as well, but it's really tough. And there's a lot of people who do really diligent and interesting work, which I in no way mean to denigrate, but there is something, I think, generally speaking, at the core of the way everyone is always looking upward to a particular power hub that has levers over funding, in order to secure their particular trajectory, or the trajectory of themselves and their friends, or this kind of patronage network. At the heart of some of these hiring decisions, that something that really does get lost is what the purpose of this kind of intellectual work and teaching alongside it actually is. And I think it's hard to blame people for not really taking on that big picture of what the purpose is, because of the precarity and how it's so tied up in things like identity and politics, in a way that is, in an abstract sense, not necessarily just the politics of the workplace. Though some hope that I at least have seen is more greater politicization simply of the workplace of academia over time. Though certainly, if anyone is following the aforementioned UAW strike, it's hard to believe that unionization at the heart in these public institutions will be the thrust of transforming actually the incentive structure at the heart of it. It's certainly necessary, but it's not going to change the underlying terms. At least that's my view and my experience of these sorts of environments.
Yeah, so I have done a lot on the UAW strikes. I've had some people who were involved on the bleeding edge come in, tell me about the limitations. Conversely, we've been talking about this problem in the humanities and novelty seeking in research. And ironically, I think it's been to the detriment of the research. And it's definitely been to the detriment of teaching.
Mm-hmm.
But so what do I mean by that? I mean, there's a tendency to find niche things in text right now that lead you into all kinds of just almost actively ignoring prior research to make an original claim, on one hand. And then there's the other hand, where like there's a decoupling of any empirical or historical, for lack of a better term, rigor. And I realize there's all kinds of associations with throwing that term around. Where you're just basically ad hocing theoretical apparatuses together to generate something unique through one or two lenses, as if you are working with a kaleidoscope. And often I don't feel like that actually illuminates that much about either the lenses are what is being looked at. So these are two big tendencies you see in humanities academia. One of the things I've never understood, and this, despite the quote postmodern turn and really we should say the post-structuralist turn, because postmodernism is too vague a concept. Mm-hmm. In the 1970s, is there was an aspiration to be scientific, even down to the way that we decided to write. In the humanities, like we adopted a pseudoscientific posture of thesis, hypothesis, and whatever as a means of writing, not without some positive effect, but like it was based off the idea that what we did could be structured the same way as reporting on a scientific experiment, and thus we started this tendency that I think also disconnected us from humanities academics in particular, from the general public, and made us easily, like, made even good research easily mockable because of it. I mean, we can think about not so much the Elaine Sokol affair and the Sokol hoax, but all the subsequent stuff that came after it. Mm-hmm. As an example of this, where people could not even if they were fairly well educated and literate, just pick up a work of humanities scholarship and comprehend what was actually at stake in it anymore.
I mean, there's a lot there. I think I want to take the sort of first part with what you said about the ad hoc theoretical apparatuses. It's funny. I have an example that I think kind of speaks to this, and it's kind of a little on the nose, but it's common, in my time. So I was a PhD student in comparative literature at University of California, Santa Barbara, which meant I spent a lot of time across different departments, including English, history, film and media, and a few others, religious studies. And over the course of that time, I've heard both from multiple people and through direct kind of interaction with people and mentors trying to guide graduate students toward the job market in their career, who mean well. But often, like, some of the suggestions that students would get is to pull together basically a few authors. So just take, for example, Deleuze, Freud, and then some contemporary author. Take a subject, whether it's a film or like an object, a work of art, some works of literature, pull together some theoretical apparatus, literally invent a term, just come up with a term, and then write essentially a narrative, right, that speaks to all of the things you've corralled together, in some coherent form, right? So emphasis on the coherence of the argument rather than the structure of, sorry, hold on, losing my headphones here. All right. Emphasis on the coherence of the argument rather than the actual structure of the research and investigation, in any sense that is durable, that's really deeply in touch with a field of knowledge, right? That's stuff you end up doing after the fact, right? To dot I's and cross T's.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just a kind of a method for teaching, grad students who ultimately want to be trained in something, but there aren't the resources, whether it's of mentorship or of time, given the teaching workloads we spoke about, right? Given the exploitation that needs to happen of graduate students' labor to really dig into the university context of, like, kind of the origins of what the universities were, which I'm not saying those are necessarily good, right? But we have to remember what universities are, like as an institution with a history, which isn't fundamentally a place simply for the training of public scholars who are meant to influence the world in some sense, right? These are often places of the intersection of free thought and religious authority, historically, at least in some sense. So the incentives and then the mentorship around this sort of ad hoc theoretical work, coupled with, again, the precarity of the job market, means that, structurally speaking, it is incredibly difficult to actually venture into deep historical work. And I want to bracket the departments in history a little bit, because they are somewhat exempt from this in certain ways. However, they have an even deeper funding crisis.
Yeah.
And I think there's those are not unrelated than other parts of the humanities, or things like the digital humanities, which serve, big tech and these notions of the innovative side of humanist discourses that often are overlap with corporate interests and the interests of certain stakeholders across the economy. And so what all this leads to is, like you said, right? And I think knowing your audience and knowing you a bit and your interests, often these revivals of these certain brands of returns to different scholars in a kind of cyclical way that actually ends up ignoring anything learned along the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So instead of reading the history of Marxism, right, we just read Marx again. Um, instead of reading the lineage of something like psychoanalysis, right, we'll read a chapter from a Freud book in a seminar, and that'll be that, right? And we'll have these general context with these primary sources, maybe a few secondary sources, and then the rest of it ends up being um, a very niche interest that I think ultimately succumbs to your point about post-structuralism or postmodernism to be a bit sloppy with the overlap, that these niche interests can't cohere really as a structure of a field or a discipline in any genealogical sense, but ultimately end up fraying into a bunch of different nodes that sit in singular pieces individuated from one another, which I think is a symptom of whatever you want to call it, neoliberalism, or just the continual rise of individualism that is liberalism. Um, it it is it's incredibly deeply entrenched in discourses around in the humanities, in American universities, and also a little less perhaps in Europe, but that's a complicated story that I think we might bracket.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this. One of the things about the humanities, and my background's actually similar to yours. My master's is in poetry. Master's of Fine Arts is in poetry, but I have a subspecialization in theory, and I have education in writing, which is practical, as the teaching of writing to young students, and then degrees in liberal studies. In my case, that was mixture of philosophy and anthropology, and a degree in like traditional English major sort of background. And I've done because of that particular background, and because that I'm effectively ABD too. I've done a whole lot of research in a bunch of different things. I mean, what I thought I was training to be, believe it or not, was a Koreanist. Way back in the day, when I thought I was going to go back and finish a PhD in Korean American literature and study Korean culture. So it was a very strange path to what I was on, but what I discovered was fads, basically, and a teaching that was both, and it's hard to explain how it ends up being this, both entirely too broad, and I don't mean that in like the generalist sense, because it doesn't produce generalists.
Mm-hmm.
You take your first. I took 5 philosophy courses before I got to a philosophy course where we actually completed more than one entire text. Like, here's 3 essays by Quine. Here's an essay or a part of an essay by Wittgenstein. Here's some stuff by Carnap. Here's some stuff by Nietzsche. Here's some stuff by Heidegger. Had good luck with that. You know, let's talk about Foucault and the death of the author. Blah blah blah, but nothing of any significant engagement, even to understand the context of the essays I was given. And then when I started, and when I was in the master's program and in the MFA program, and I started specializing as a subspecialization to poetry, like a critical theoretical apparatus, to back that up, it was hyper specific immediately. You know, it's like, okay, now you need to like read everything by Althusser and get into Althusser and Althusserian Marxism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also, we're only applying this to the works of Southern authors from 1880 to 1950, and even better yet, if you limit which race of people you're studying. And it's just like, okay, so you move from the hyper broad to the incredibly specific very quickly. Actually, it's like we've been studying everything. You have some subspecialization in your senior year in your undergrad, and then you immediately go into micro specializations. And I part of that feels like it's because it's supposed to track the way you learn science, I guess. Like, because that kind of makes sense if you think about a broad scientific education. But it doesn't make sense when you're talking about, like, I can't even contextualize all the debates of which I'm being exposed to and also asked to teach.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, this was my ambivalence about the whole teaching retirement. You made a point that I think is really good. That's actually tends to be more relevant to what what the institution's for and what you're doing. I started learning all these debates, not from the classes, not even from my research, but to be able to answer the questions of my students. Which also meant that I had to be willing to do additional research on basic shit that I wasn't taught, to do a job on top of trying to create original research myself. Now I was an MFA, so this is both creative work and research, because that was the nature of the program. Sometimes programs are one or the other. I had to do both. And that was nuts. Then I get moved into a teaching program, which is so completely different that you don't even know what to do with it. Like, it's not anything at all like the rest of academia. It's basically a practical training program with a lot of stuff about how to do paperwork, frankly. And then there is some critical pedagogy in there. There is some scholarship, but the scholarship standards are also, frankly, way lower. And you just realize, oh, the humanities are very specific in what they're asking. And then, however, when I'm like trying to help students figure out why this would be relevant to them, this is actually somewhat hard to do with the let's talk about composition theory and how Omi K. Baba's decolonial X applies to this very specific Korean American text from 1985. And it took a lot of the fun out of it for me, particularly when I realized the stuff I was pouring my energy into had no audience. That its likelihood of being read by anybody was pretty low, even when it got published.
And that point, I think, is so crucial. I mean, everything you said, but something that's really, I mean, I'll use this word also with the kind of psychoanalytic intonation, hovering, it perverse about, I think, the experience of contemporary mid to high level academic discourse is precisely that there's these two poles, right? And you narrated them, right? There's this sense of generality and this niche pole, this sense of expertise or narrowing. One could probably, draw it in many different kinds of graphical forms, where not only, right, you're meant to have an outwardly facing general understanding of many different debates, right? You're supposed to check boxes. Does your work have a critique of political economy, right? Do you say the words like in capital X, Y, and Z? Yes. Okay, good.
Do I throw the word material interest around enough?
There you go, right?
Like continual conditions or
all
whatever.
All these buzzwords, right? That have to check boxes in order to maintain a certain amount of disciplinary relevance and then social relevance, both in the discourse of academic thought, but also in the wider sense of what many of these humanities programs see themselves as doing. And I keep coming back to that point, right? Because I think there's later on in this point that I'm going to make, there's a kind of deep identity crisis actually at the heart of the humanities, and this, there's a crisis in the humanities about what it is and what it's doing. And I think you're pushing on this point about audience, and you're pushing on this point about what training really looks like, what it's for, And so I say all of that to say, right, being pulled in these two different directions. On the one hand, I have to know the ins and outs of, right, decolonial theory, the environmental humanities, the history of German philosophy and media theory, the history of political economy in the Western world, a general sense of post-colonial thought, formal analysis, right, across different aesthetic categories, uh, 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 linguistic skills, right? You know, you have to know at least. It is said one has to know or have a translating knowledge of 2 or 3 languages in many humanities programs. So there's this general sense of which a generalist, a general knowledge of the history of thought is a must. It's something that you have to have, or at least you have to be able to speak to, gesture at in
You have to
ways that
be able to
often.
fake it, if nothing else.
Exactly. You have to be able to fake it because you have to gesture at it in ways that that show that you are gesturing at it, right? When you actually dig or ask critical questions about these things, there's nothing there often, right? Some people have specialties and have studied these things, and sure, they know the ins and outs of it, but in a more generalist sense, it's a facade. And I think that's kind of how a lot of work is, right? In contemporary society, right? You have to speak to a general understanding and then have 1 or 2 things that you actually understand. So that's a way in which academia doesn't deviate very far from typical corporate life. And then it comes down to, like you said, what the actual skill set is. Like, what is the actual interest? What is the skill set? And so, for example, one of mine was I taught German language. And I like that is something that I could do. That was a skill. That was something that students wanted to learn because they wanted to be engineers, sometimes for a sense of cosmopolitan cultural knowledge. But that is something that could be marketed and was marketed, right? Like it was an enterprise. It was seen as such to the department and other departments that I encountered in my time. And you know, another aspect of what I ended up having to really learn and get a deep knowledge of was ancient to medieval Western literature. This is not something that I specialized in. This is something that really played a part in any of my research or my public intellectual engagement. But this is something that when brass tacks, I had to understand and learn the insides and outs of Greek tragedy, of all the way up until from Greek works of literature up to Dante and the very early modern works of literature. These are classes that I taught, over multiple years, and but the thing about that is, so I think it's interesting then how thinking with at least my research trajectory, cutting edge theory, political economy, and the humanities was what my research agenda was. But when push came to shove, what I actually did for the university was taught engineering students German and fulfilled a requirement to teach, almost 5 weeks of the Odyssey and then another sampling of other works of literature. And there's variation there, but I think this speaks to a kind of crisis where a lot of the institutional legacy of academia and these departments is very caught up in its canon, its genealogy, and I think rightfully so, in the sense that that is how institutions work, right? The institutions develop over time. People are trained over time to teach a particular set of canonical texts and then add on particular research agendas to that. That is often how departments work. I mean, the joke in film departments is, the first film anyone ever learns is Citizen Kane. And that is, again, for a reason. There is a genealogy and a canon that people speak to, but then what ends up happening is the other pull ends up asserting itself. This pull to novelty, this facade that is necessary to continue to generate the idea of an innovative research trajectory over time, and of the development of particular disciplines as having some sort of movement forward in almost like an idealistic sense of moral good. And so what ends up happening is there's this duality at play, and it's a perverse set of incentives where the canon pulls us in one direction, and then the need to be cutting edge, novel, I think a word that we brought up in some of our conversations, polemical, political, asserts itself on the other end. And one is more of the traditional sense of what the university has done over a long period of time, the canonical stuff. And the other is both a political imperative but in a more deeper sense, a material imperative at the heart of needing to justify the existence of the humanities to begin with. Because there are maybe deeper people who think more deeply about the present and present political economy and history. Maybe the Fukuyamists out there could speak to something about this. But in our contemporary moment, there is, I think, a deep sense in which, whether it's the kind of fracturing of neoliberalism or like what neoliberalism wrought for so many years, there's something lost about what the purpose of academia is. And so it ends up spinning in this way to try and find that sense of purpose, that place in society. And I think we even see shifts, right? There's a split on the right and the left has a view of the critical university and things like that I think are in the abstract and in the sense of what my opinion is just good, like generally a good thing. But the right has a view of an intransigent, traditional Western civilization based analysis of a particular historical narrative and canon. And so these two things are pulling against each other. And I think there's a fracture then at the heart of what academics are meant to do amidst all of these torrents of variables. And then, when they have to think about, ultimately, when push comes to shove and their salaries on the line, the ideals often go out the window. At least that is my experience of many academics in this moment, navigating things like financial crises or budget crises or things like strikes, where it takes actually putting oneself on the line to really be in solidarity with people in the lower strata. So there's a lot there, but I think that's me trying to speak to what you're describing, right? This sort of generalist view. We're not producing generalists, and there isn't an acknowledgement of what is happening, which is really a very niche, a continued fraying into many different niche interests on behalf of research agendas, which I think, generally speaking, like, are good, as in, like, it's good for people to be able to research things that they're interested in, but that comes in complicated tension with the market and the institutional structures that that kind of self-guided research sits within.
Yeah, so there's the critical apparatus, there's the research apparatus, which may or may not overlap with the critical apparatus, and then there's this traditional apparatus. And let's first be honest about where the humanities come from. Like, it comes from religious instruction and legal instruction. In the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, in both America and in England, it was an answer to the German academic programs that were beginning to develop in the middle of the 19th century, particularly German philology, which is why we started building a literary canon and a classics canon, constructing it the way that we do now, with elements of the old Christian stuff in there, the Protestant stuff in there, go all the way back to ancient Greeks. I mean, I make this point all the time from an anthropological point of view. The reason why we think of like ancient Greece as Western civilization, the reason why we think of it as Western civilization at all, as opposed to like claiming Persian civilization as Western, which maybe we should, or something like that, like, is kind of an accident of competing nationalisms in the 19th century. To think of the, and a kind of tenuous relation to the classics, trying to come up with a secular justification outside of Christendom for the need for these universities. That I think in the humanities, that's more intensely felt because that's where our canon comes from. And then other political competition that emerges in the mid 20th century and the way that institutionalized itself in the teaching of children. So like if there's an awful lot of modernism in the way we teach like contemporary literature to kids, because that's when it was fucking formulated. Like we nailed this together as something other than like some schoolmarm somewhere trying to get people to read anything in the 1920s to the 1950s, and it shows up in our canonical texts, and then its expansions continue. For example, when we started including like Latin literature or African American literature, the moment we start including it's the moment you start seeing the stuff that's in there. And while there is innovation in that from the universities, I can tell you, when you go and like say you learn English and you go and teach English, the irony is what you teach students in an English class, if you're a traditional English major, you haven't read since you've been in high school. Like, you were not actually trained on the Great Gatsby, or the Shakespeare's the exception, but like, sure. But in general, like, no, you don't actually read that stuff that much anymore. It's not part of what you do. And then there's all the other, so like, I remember the first time I was asked to teach like a literature 2010 class, and I'm having to teach Tartuffe and Oedipus, and I got obsessed with all this stuff. But again, my research background was poetry of the Americas. Like, it's just like American poetry, Latin American poetry, poetry in Spanish and English, and a little bit of poetry in German because I have a working understanding of German. And to speak to your thing about the practical and the language component of this, even before I had stayed in Germany, like, I passed that German language exam. I am not fluent in German. I'm okay at it. I am proficient in German, although if you really wanted me to like teach German literature with that level of knowledge, it would be a joke.
Well, I mean, I'll just say straight up, right? Language proficiency in graduate school, unless you're in explicitly, like, for example, a German department or a French department, where you are day in, day out teaching that language as an end product of your training. But generally across the humanities, it's a joke. I mean, it's a box checking exercise, and it makes sense that it is, because no one has the time to spend the years required to learn a language. I mean, right? Like, it's one of the harder things to do, not as a child, right? I mean, these are things that just like go unsaid and unremarked upon, right? The only reason why I know German is because I lived there, and then was able to add on after the fact, right, through study and reading and things like that. Yeah. But
I lived in German and I'm still not fluent. I mean, I lived in Germany. I lived in Munich for about 9 months, and I'm still not fluent.
The grammar is a difficult one, but this is just right, it's another example, like you said, right, you ended up encountering and having to teach works that you've never really encountered, read, maybe not since high school. So what ends up happening is students and then professors get trained to be readers, right? You are meant to encounter a text, and like, I'm not going to get into the formalist versus, contextualist debates and these sorts of things. Like, I don't want to get into literary theory here, but the point being is, you encounter a set of texts and a set of histories and contexts with a kind of preset methodological approach, how you interpret that text. And this is generally how people interpret text. But there's a difference between, okay, doing like there's a thing called grad school reading, and any grad student would know, right? You grad school read a book, which is usually parts of the intro, maybe a chapter that you're interested in, move on. And there's a lot of skimming that happens, a lot of just not reading at all that happens.
I mean, let's be honest about your reading list you're given when you go into a PhD program or an FA program, any terminal degree. You can't meaningfully do it in 2 years and it be close reading. You can't. It's impossible. No one actually
right
does.
Because once again, we run into the structural identity crisis at the heart of what the university is, right? Where it's like, what is it that we're doing here? Are we meant to spend like 6 years doing a PhD, not teaching at all, reading one very narrow disciplinary canonical list, writing on one of its forefathers, and then producing a piece of work? Like, I still, I worked with academics who were old enough that is what they did, right? Back, before the 70s, or maybe in the 70s, where that was what the job was, right? You would master the canon inside and out, right? If you were a Germanist, you'd read Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud, and if you wanted to take some ventures into more of the idealists or others, you'd pick your poets, and you'd pick your literary figures, and you would focus in that tradition on those particular questions. The tradition itself was seen as prestigious enough to justify the endeavor. Whereas now there is a greater need to justify the self as the researcher outside of any tradition of works with which one embarks upon researching. And this produces a deeply intention and ultimately confusing set of incentives for people. And oftentimes the work ends up being the result of those incentives jumbled together, right? And this is where I think we get into a lot of writing that ends up deeply political, and I think ultimately from a moral perspective, deeply good, in a sort of abstract sense, but that can't actually capture any of the underlying structural imperatives that are at the heart of why there is this feeling of such a political impasse and such a confusion of trajectories, right? Nothing is clear with where you are supposed to go, where you're supposed to begin, and that confusion ends up being the breeding ground for exploitation of labor, and of labor in multiple forms, including in assistantships, but also, of course, in just underpaying teachers, and underhousing, and ultimately relying on people, like you said, who have independent wealth or loans to perpetuate the system. And so there's something that is kind of, it's pretty deeply untractable there, which is not to say that the work is not interesting, but it has to be viewed through the lens of those intractable contradictions in the first place, I think, to understand what it means socially and historically, outside of the terms that a lot of this work is setting up for itself.
Right. I mean, I think, again, to add this institutional history back, we have to remind ourselves what the university comes from.
Mm-hmm.
My frenemy Colin Drum and I actually talk about this, and we talk about, like, okay, yeah, in some ways the university is a medieval institution. It's one of the few left of any heft in modern life and anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And its structural setup, it reflects that. In other ways, it's a completely modern institution that's really an invention of the Cold War, and then grafted on to that. And this is where a lot of people make superficial and rather dumb comparisons about, like, oh, well, there's a class of educated managers. And I'm like, well, at the end of the Fordist system, there was an attempt to use universities to educate management. Then it became a way to sort people and outsource training from all jobs into the public cost sphere or onto private coffers and not the job itself. So, for example, I used to work in insurance, and I know the history of things like actuaries. It's a weird thing to know the history of, but I do.
Mm-hmm.
Actuarial stuff used to just require an associate's level understanding of math and statistics. You could get it with a high school degree and in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and your job would pay for you to get a few more classes to have the specific kinds of statistical knowledge you need, and then it became a kind of program within accounting. And now it requires something like the equivalent of a master's degree, basically, to do. Some of that is because the increased complexity of statistics you have to deal with, but a lot of it is actually just to limit job applicants. One of the interesting things about right now that we have to look at in this, like, political economic turn is we're going to see a lot of those credentializations reverse because there's just not enough people.
Mm-hmm.
But that's been grafted on and yet changed the nature of the institution. In the humanities in particular, I think we talk about the split. Like, okay, we're in one hand, we're viewed as the bestowers of this cultural tradition of Western culture, or even, let's take even broader view, multi-ethnic liberal culture. Both
Mm-hmm.
things have canons in which we inculcate, and we also inculcate both of them. Like, but we're also seen as practical job trainers. As you said, you were teaching German to engineering students. I used to teach people how to write English and read English so they could, in other countries, so they could participate in science scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this other critical mission in the humanities that we see ourselves as, like, well, we're also criticizing this tradition that we're safeguarding and developing new forms of inquiry through this criticism. But as you said, there's this need for originality, and there's also a need for programs to be attractive. So there's a couple of different pools. So you see pools towards incorporating pop culture, but with advanced scholarly critical lenses, are moves towards, finding marginalized groups in the past and bringing up the literature, but often also somewhat overstating how common it was to have read them. And these are actually good things.
Mm-hmm.
I think in some ways all of these things, except for maybe outsourcing jobs training from private institutions into the public, are good things. But in the humanities, we're kind of expected to do all of them. Like, I will say this: the sciences have their issues, and they are numerous and beyond the scope of the show, but they are different on this front. Like, and one of the weird things right now, okay, we were talking about the crisis of history. You can't convince people to be English majors, even though it's, like, more profitable than being a business majors, and I don't think we should justify it that way. It's just like there's so few of us who do it that now it's become a sought after skill to have the basic level of reading and writing, and yet I couldn't tell you what we're actually like. I have trouble understanding why the traditional English major exists still, other than to create teachers for high school students. But even that, we increasingly don't teach that kind of literature in high school anymore. Like there's just less and less of it. So who are we what is this preparing anyone for, including the scholars themselves? And it's not clear to me that it is. And it's also, there's another element of it, I guess we kind of beat around the bush about it, where we are training people off of the assumption we're training them to do the thing that they are studying under, which is to be a university researcher and teacher, professor of some sort. But we all know that we're not, too.
Right.
Like there's way too many people needed to uphold this system to even keep it functioning. Then there could possibly be jobs that, and so there's this pervasive cynicism in the humanities, and yet people aren't like, and I'm like, okay. And this is something where I almost become sympathetic to the conservative critique, where I'm like, so we're having people spend, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of their money, hundreds of thousands of dollars of their time,
lost income and opportunity,
right? To maintain a system of which 1 in 20 of them are going to be able to actually use what they're being trained for, and yet we're also not changing what we're doing with that in mind.
It's so interesting. I'm so glad you brought up this last point, because I mean, it's one of those things that everyone says, right? Like, well, obviously there's not enough jobs, right? And like, yeah, there obviously is. And everyone knows that. But like you said, no one changes behaviors, right? Like there's these, what it ends up being is this aspirational desire for there to be more jobs. And then, okay, well, there aren't jobs, but you're here, which is, understandable. Like I understand professors who approach graduate students say, you're here, I have to try to give you the best mentorship that I can, given the circumstances, which is often do something that is flashy and new and interesting, right? That is at a particular intersection. You pitch your sail just perfectly to catch the wind, and maybe you'll get lucky. But I'm in the habit more recently of trying to strip down institutional social arrangements into what the kind of bare bones experience of them are. That's at least how I'm approaching the world. And as you were talking about all these particular different grafted on responsibilities that then the humanities has to do all of because they have to self-justify, what it made me think of is what the actual experience of a university is, like actually what it is, right? Outside of these abstract notions of the things that we are studying in our head. And it comes back to me, for me, back down to that kind of enculturation purpose, right? That is this legacy of the medieval institution. And then, as you said, right, this challenging the German university and its stature in the 19th century, which itself had a very distinct cultural role within Protestantism, and a juridical role, and a very complex intersection that I don't necessarily need to get into for this point. But really what it is it's a place for people to congregate, pass on knowledge, relate in many different ways, in culturally approved and disapproved ways. It's a space of a particular form of relation that provides an experience to students, whether they are undergrads or graduate students, or crucially, professors, right? It's an experience of life that is distinct. And it's a space that is meant to host that experience of life. And it's one that's meant not to be grounded in toil and physical activity, but mental work and mental discipline alongside collaborative forms of kind of, like you said, like liberal comings together of a multi-ethnic or diverse polity that is meant to inhabit that space in a particular way. And that then ends up going on to produce, good citizens, quote unquote, good workers, or good thinkers along the way. But if someone were to have told me before I went into graduate school, look, you're not going to get a job, but like really, you're not going to get a job. Not like, but you never know, right? Not there's the hope. But what you can get is a particular experience that is distinct and interesting, and will allow you to investigate things that you are particularly interested in ways that are, not on a strict 9 to 5 time schedule. Like, we forget to talk about these things, right? The perks and benefits that are where you have summers off and a winter break and a spring break, as an adult. And you're surrounded by other people your age who are doing a similar thing. There is meaning to be had here as a social experience, right? One that enculturates and offers a space for a particular kind of self-edification that we often end up seeing the result of the research being anyway, that I think could be socially useful when it's positioned and framed or approached in the right way. And I think that's honestly the way most people view it, is a haven from the toil of the workplace. And to me, I'm very sympathetic and have benefited from that. But I think the problem ultimately is that ends up being completely divorced from what the underlying institutional purpose ends up being. So you have these fraught tensions that end up playing themselves out. And, in some sense, that's just humanity. This is just an institution, and that's kind of how they work. But in another sense, I think that view really cuts against, like, any answer to the question that is put in clear terms, like, what is actually the purpose of an English degree, of reading James Joyce? Is it to understand the innate post-structural impulses in the sort of 20th century pre-fascist Western European context? Or is it just a way of thinking through certain aspects and affects that are inherent in a kind of literary approach to the world? I mean, that we inhabit, right? Like, where is the actual locus of causality, and, dare I say, like the sort of grounded meaning of what is actually going on here, whether it's read from a very strictly sort of critical political economic lens or a critical psychoanalytic one. I think ultimately they both end up intersecting back towards that project of enculturation, and that's the space of that experience, which is why the conservatives and the right wingers do have to attack the university, because that goes against their project of eliminating the self in a liberal sense, and cultivating a good ordered conservative society. But at the same time, they also have a vision for the academic life as a part of that project of enculturating their good citizens as well. So, I mean, at least that's how I'm looking at the way this crisis is manifesting politically, and then at the level of the underlying structures.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's interesting, and I think we have to ask ourselves then, I mean, to me, there's two liberal subjects too. I mean, like, for example, and this is not something we've mentioned, but the totally cynical element of networking in the humanities that can emerge, particularly at the Ivies. And in which case, the humanities really is there for people to leave it, and then to start other things, whether it's public advocacy jobs, editing, going into law, whatever. And in those cases, how do I say this? The humanities is kind of a holding ground, and yet, you know, I don't think that's most people's experience, but it is an experience out there. And when conservatives want to say something, that's what they're going to bring up, because that's the easiest thing. Well, oh, it's not really about education anyway. It's just about networking. Like, and to be honest with you, there is a certain amount of truth to that. But so that's like a fifth or sixth thing we're scaffolding onto this.
Yeah,
right?
I mean that. Well, there's a lot of education alongside, right? I think
Right.
I would never say there's not education, but it's right. Education in a vacuum, it doesn't. It means very little, I think, to me, right? It's like, where does that then go? How does that intellect and that what is learned get directed, both individually and then socially?
Yeah, and that's to me that's important, because I don't think taking a completely cynical view of what's going on is actually going to help you. And by that, oh, it's just networking. Or I learned a lot in grad school about how to read that has enabled me to be able to self-educate at a pretty rigorous level. I was not, for example, my interest in Marxism history, I'm an autodidact in that. But I'm not really an autodidact, because I was trained in how to read and contextualize text. Like, in the shitty way that I was trained in some cases, because it was, way too much at a time. It's like, I remember going to a class and they're like, okay, we're reading a theory book and a novel by Faulkner every week. Which, no, you're not. Like, I mean, I attempted
Nobody
to.
is.
Like,
I mean, I think the one time I fully read the, like, when within like an insane assignment like that, the one time I actually fully read it was like my second quarter before I knew better. And I, would start reading at 6 p.m. and I would finish at midnight. And over the course of the week, I'd be able to complete the assignment. But like, it's impossible to sustain that level of vigorous, I mean, at least I think, at least plausibly speaking, like, from my experience of other people reading, that's not what ends up happening, right?
Mine was the same thing. As for the first semester of my graduate school, I really did the reading for real, and I almost died.
Right.
Like, because I also had to grade 120 essays a week, and then write papers, and my paper quality started really declining because I was doing the work, which was absurd. So you learned how, for most professors, and everyone hated these professors. There were professors that would try to, like, old school trick you, and like, okay, we're taking a Maymester class and this was another absurd one, read everything Hawthorne's ever written in 4 weeks. Right. And I'm going to test you with quote explication tests, which don't come up a lot.
Well, there are a few sadists out there, so that's why.
And this was one of those professors that totally would, like, your graduate degree, well, you just got your B, which for everybody who's not in graduate school, that's not, for most people, it's not a big deal. For graduate school, it's like, oh, ooh.
Yeah. It's rare not to get an A in graduate school. I think A minus.
It's kind of hard.
Yeah.
Like, you actually have to not do the work. Except in this class. But it was a good reminder of how impossible it was, because it's like, it in some ways actually exposed the lie. Because it's like, we all know that we can't really do this to any significant level of rigor and do everything else you're asking us and meet all these suggestions and teach. Okay, and also I'm teaching by the second year. I'm teaching myself, undergraduate. So I got to do the reading for that. And honestly, I usually do actually have to do the reading for that, as to not totally appear like a jackass for my students.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this weird sort of dissonance where you're like, okay, the stuff that I'm supposed to be reading for myself, I'm actually not reading very deeply at all. I'm doing exactly what you say. We're going to read the beginning, ending. We're gonna do keyword searches for anything related to anything interesting I read in the thesis. Then I'm going to read some secondary literature about it, and then I'm going to go back and find quotes to back that up, and then that's how we're going to approach this. Except for the key work that I'm going to be actually doing some serious work on, and I really am going to read that very closely. But then, like, I'm reading all this stuff. It's not even supposed to come up that I'm teaching, that I'm just supposed to already be super familiar with, which we all have talked about how we're not. And so we're having to read that because in some ways, like, I know my students are going to catch me out on not really knowing that more than my professors want to catch me out on it. It's like they know that they're teaching me, and no one ever says this, but they know it. They know that they're teaching me a way of showing intellect in a lot of areas and like having passable seeming knowledge, but not really having to engage it except on a few key points. Like, yes, if you don't know what you're writing your dissertation on in real intimate detail, you are indeed fucked.
Right.
But
right.
I don't think anyone really expects you, even for one of the hardest comp tests, to have actually slowly and deeply read all 350 books on your reading list for comps.
No, I mean, it's a joke. I mean, I have to say, right? It's there's the moment where you're assigned the reading list, and then there's like the wink,
Yeah.
right? It's like, and it's funny because I was in a department that was like considered archaic when it came to comps, because the remnants of the sort of older comp lit discipline, which was a lot more kind of, let's just say, rigorous within its terms, it was very difficult, and these exams were very difficult when I compared them to, for example, English or film and media or other types of exams that people would do and take. But and it's funny, like in the department I was in, like we just reformed that. We just changed that and made them easier because no one could meet the standard of that old way of doing things. But these things have just slowly happened without an actual like reform of the underlying purpose and structure. And I think I want to address in the part that you said about networking, because I don't want it to be misconstrued that what my suggestion is that the humanities or the university is all about networking. I think much more so than networking, it's about self edification, self discovery, and the experience of adulthood through this mediated form of an intellectual life that is meant to prepare you for encountering the world. And so there's this funny heuristic I have, like thinking about and reflecting back to grad school. It's like you can know the trajectory of someone by what happens after they read Nietzsche. Do they decide to make peace with the world and enter it and leave, or do they take the deeply cynical route that ends up staying in the structure of the academic space that Nietzsche so hated and rejected after his time in it? Or do they completely erase all the insights and end up just deciding that it is and can be a haven from the world, even when it very deeply isn't an outside of the structures of the economy that most in the humanities would at least passingly critique. And I think that ends up being the problem for a lot of scholarship that ends up getting stuck in a few of those different pathways, right? You end up being a deeply critical Marxist or a post-structuralist that really believes in outsides, or you end up down the path of a kind of, how would I put this? Just a bit more idealistic approach to reform, then perhaps is merited. And usually those people are on tenure track, I guess I would say.
Yeah, but to say, if you actually learn the lessons of the critical scholarship, it's often detrimental to your critical scholarly career.
Well, that's the problem, right? That's ultimately the problem, I think, right? I think that statement captures the structural contradiction that's at the heart of this job, right? Because in a lot of ways, there isn't much more to say. That's I think ultimately a problem that I couldn't unsee, is that there isn't that much more to do or say. Right? It's like there's the economic structures that are intransigent and can be struggled against by different levers and means, including unionization, etc. There's the psychoanalytic components. There's the institutional logic. But what else is there? That's kind of it.
Yeah, and so, well, one of the things I would say is I would also limit this when I did not network in university very well. And if I was only in there for the cynical reasons, I probably could have and done a lot more with it. But I don't look back on my days of being in graduate school as like that. And I also, despite the economic costs, despite the absurdity of some of what we're talking about, I don't completely regret doing it either.
Same. Yeah, same.
But I'm glad that I didn't go all the way. Because I do think that I know people who that becomes a cul-de-sac for them, and there are ways out of it, and people are trying to figure that out. But it's often very damaging to people, and I find it interesting because I've had conservative friends who dropped out. I've had very, very left-wing friends. One of my mentors was a conservative Hegelian scholar. Part of how I became a Marxist, to his great shame. He probably loses sleep about it now. But he eventually dropped out and becomes like a philosophical ethics counselor, because he just found the work unrewarding, and not just from it's full of liberals. I mean, he would complain about that too, but he was just like, I don't know what the work is doing anymore, is what he would often talk to me about. It's like, it's not even that, it's just pushing, he would have said political correctness at the time that I was talking about. This is about 15 years ago, and we were colleagues at that point. But it's like, I don't know what I even want from this institution. Like, I don't know if I got the classical education that I supposedly promote as a good, conservative educator, that it would even fix the problem, which I admired him for being that self-honest. And I think a lot of my leftist and liberal friends had the same kinds of cul-de-sacs, because they were in a lot of ways encouraged by this culture to view everything critically, to see everything politically too, and morally. And how I feel about conflating those three things, but then realizing that what they were doing had no effect on that, and it seemed wild that they would have ever believed that it would. And that's, it is weird when I try to explain, there's a lot of people when I was in grad school who really thought the critical humanities were going to change the world, and it's very hard to see that now, why anyone would have ever thought that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends what you mean by change the world, but I think I agree with the sentiment.
Well, I think, but I also think, to not be totally cynical for a moment, that if we had been able to deliver on the mission in which we were supposedly engaged in, which was truly not abandoning Western culture, and I think that's a conservative straw man of what left and liberal academics are really trying to do. But really reinterrogating, reintegrating it, expanding it, making it re-relevantizing it, etc. And by re-relevantizing it, I don't mean like like making it knowledge relative. I mean like making it relevant again, as part of our understanding, both for good and ill, of how our the narrative of the way we understand our political economy and culture. I think if we'd actually been able to do that, it would have had some pretty big social effects. And interestingly, we kind of have done some of that. One of the things about this that we have seen is like when I was in grad school, the kinds of terminologies we used in grad school, you would have never seen in the New York Times, like even if they were discussing some of the same books. Now you can find that stuff on blogs for teenagers, like, and I mean, so that has trickled out, but hasn't been as effective as maybe we hoped. I don't know.
Well, I guess this is right. This is the culture wars stuff, right? That I think maybe, you know, we could gesture towards, right? Like discourses around around culture and gender and race and justice and discourses around trauma and these sorts of things are things that do come in part, right? Not completely, and I would never want to misconstrue that causation, but in part from the critical humanities, in certain ways, like you said, blog posts is, you know, you see that kind of language in blog posts and these sorts of things. But then the issue is, like you said, like why, like it worked, but why didn't it work? Right? I guess would be the sort of double bind question that we're left with. And I think ultimately for me is that, again, I mean, you know, it's funny after all this time that this would be coming out of my mouth, but did the underlying structural dynamic change, right? Has the culture stuff and some of that critical work given new potential weapons to particular polities in the struggle over the structure, the political structure of the family, of the way we think about, the way we talk about political issues? Absolutely. Did that create real effects? Absolutely. Now, the question, though, does ultimately, it has to revolve back to what structural dynamics shifted, right, in the aftermath of that. What incentive structures shifted in the aftermath of that. What, you know, I think shorthand, I think the word material gets misused, but what material structures have shifted and changed, and some have shifted and changed, but it's hard to parse the interplay between the way we talk about certain things and how that relates to the actual change, dare I say, like on the ground in the structures themselves. And I can say it quite clearly, like, for example, in academic, in just my particular experience with the UAW fight as a rank and file member, right? Not in leadership, but there were plenty of ways of voicing and talking about and using critical language to interrogate and investigate the relationships of power at the heart of that, of the negotiation and the precarity that graduate students feel and experience. And none of that really brushed up against the power itself, right? So then it becomes that question, right? In an almost way that we have to keep coming back to, right? Like, what actually is going to be the thing that exerts the force that opens the door for that talk and those intellectual understandings to really apply themselves. And I think that's where, you know, we have to look to history for answers to when and how those sorts of things have happened. And I know your interest in the Soviet Union and other experiences of a sort of left attempts to apply the ideas. That I'll defer to those conversations and those shows that you've done. And this is where questions over, things like social democracy and things like that, have to keep rearing their head. Like, actually, how are these ideas going to be able to be applied in institutional contexts? And this is where I think ultimately that a lot of like the left lawyer space becomes a space where there's potentially meaningful avenues to affect change through levers of power, but there's a lot of difficulties there too. But I think, given my experience and given my proximity to certain types of polemical political language over the years, I don't see how that language can do more at this point than convince people intellectually of what justice could look like. Then the question becomes, what are we going to do? And I think, who has the answer to that? Certainly make yourself known if you do.
I think this is actually some really crucial things to think about, because I think about the Soviet Union. One of the things I'll say is, like, the educational capacity of the USSR, even if you're not a Marxist, has to be remarked upon how fast they build up an educational capacity of a serious degree, and of which, compared to, say, modern Western academia, both in the United States and in contemporary Europe, was more actually meritocratic. And I say this as a person who thinks almost all notions of meritocracy are kind of bullshit. But there was more there. I also think it's led to a lot of people to, like, miss some crucial things. Like, for example, even to this day, Russia is a highly educated society. It does not lead to what a lot of people who try to sell education as a neoliberal improvement project or a Fordist improvement project or whatever. It just clearly doesn't do that. I cannot tell you how many civil and structural engineers I met in Egypt and in Mexico who were working menial labor jobs, like with and it's way more than you would think. Like, it was actually sort of shocking. So I don't have any illusions about what this does in and of itself, but I do think, for the people who are inclined towards it, and I don't want to overvalue education either, but I don't want to undervalue it. We live in this. I feel like we live in a time, because of our particular political economic structure, where we have a kind of incoherence, not quite right. The other metaphor is insulting to people with schizophrenia, so I'm not going to use it. But contradictory and unstable notion of what the value of intellectual work is, and the value of this kind of training would be, and whether or not everybody really needs it. And my answer is no, but for the people who could do it, they could actually help a whole lot of people by doing it who don't need it. And I do really believe that. And I don't want to say, like, oh, everybody needs to go to graduate school. No, not everybody does. But there's a lot of stuff that, if we could, ground this in other more stable social systems. You talk about social democracy, you talk about universal basic services, and I use universal basic services advisedly, not just universal basic income. where this might be a more meaningful distinction where we can start saying, okay, well, you know, some people don't need this, some people do. Everyone's needs are met. There's enough work to go around. So and we can utilize these skills if we want to. So, you know, there are ways to do this that are interesting. And I think another thing that we haven't really talked about is, you know, the cultural part of this is really good, but and I do believe in institutions as social institutions and that learning is social. So I should also caveat, like, there's a reason why even if you use Sci-Hub to break all the barriers to access, you're still going to have issues,
Well,
right?
right. Yeah.
Like, um,
Precisely because if there's anything that grad school has taught me is that reading is not a stable, objective process. So there are many different ways to approach reading texts, and without that's the social layer, the sort of the libertarian version, just it ends up conjuring a void of, like you said, social learning.
right. You don't know. There's a whole lot of stuff beyond the text that you need to really engage and do the text. I mean, it's like when someone asks me, this is completely different, but it's related. When someone asked me, for example, you know, which book should I read to become a Buddhist? This has been asked to me multiple times in my life, and my answer is
That's
always,
a funny question.
there isn't one.
Yeah.
Like, you need to find a community that will, and then you can access the scholarships and whatever. And there's plenty of scholarship out there, and a lot of it's available for free. But it's not something that you can just go about and do on your own, because it has to be like, that learning has to be embodied in some way. And that's true for most learning, even the kinds of stuff we're talking about here. You know, there's some cynical comments that grad school is shuffling lexicon as coining phrases, and there's a certain amount of truth to that in the humanities. But there's also a way in which that's not really all that's going on.
Yeah, nothing is really ever one thing. I think is often a safe bet, right? So yeah, I mean there is that, but yet at the same time, to take the more positive, less cynical side seriously, right? I think what grad school can be at its best is uh, a community formation for trying to understand the world and what the world is. What has it been? How does it work in many different ways? What kind of expressions, in particularly in the humanities, have people made of their experience of the world and of their context, and trying to, and you know, taking in part of a community that is dedicated to doing that, could be what a graduate school project could be, right? But then I think what we're talking about is a broader, again, a broader shift in our approach to the world itself, because I think in a lot of ways there's an avoidance of what the world is at the heart of a lot of humanities discourse, an almost utopian avoidance, right? And particularly when it comes to the arts, which I think that's a part of what the world is. I mean, dare I say that, like, venturing into imaginary worlds is not a part of the world. It very much is, but I think there is again a kind of intractable problem there, whereby we are going to struggle to study the world until at certain point one can make peace with what the world is and has been. And that is often very bloody and brutal and precarious and scary. So that, I think that might be kind of the last piece of this for me, where that sort of stuff it has to be worked out. And there's always going to be an imperfect institution to house it, but the university as it stands is extremely imperfect. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I guess my only thing I'd add is the one thing I wish that we would talk about more about this, to really push on this, is getting this out there for even for the people of which this would never be appealing and they don't really need it, but we need to be in dialogue with them. Like that's one thing I do not love about academic culture is it is often cordoned off in a way in which we can't benefit from the experiences of people who aren't in it, and they can't benefit from our knowledge base. And I know that, like, I was reading Christopher Lasch again. I have a bad habit of doing that. And he was talking about the Cultural Revolution as this attack on learning, and I was like, it really wasn't, though. It was like, for all the things that we could talk about the problems of the Cultural Revolution, there were many. The rustification of the intellectuals was not actually to punish the intellectuals. It was to equalize knowledge bases between intellectuals and rural communities. That's what its aim really was about. Whether it worked or not, open question, right? I think there's some evidence that it kind of worked, but nothing ever works as well or as completely as anyone would want. But and it was resented afterwards for sure. But you know, I think that's a moment that we could actually learn something. And I kind of don't like the way Marxist discourse has gone on this particularly. Because right now there's a kind of Marxist discourse that flattens out the quote professional managerial class, which is anyone would agree, into like a horde of bad liberals who are all overprivileged and don't know anything about the true blue collar working class. And if we just rustificated them and let them have the knowledge of what it was likely, what it's like to be a real worker, they'd only understand. And of course, the people saying this are all academics, right? Like, of course, like,
yeah.
And I don't like that, but I do think there is a way in which, like, no, we should start figuring out, because we've been like, I guess the other thing that we were kind of talked about in your way of framing this within two union battles is academics are being proletarianized in a real way. And that does, and initially there was some benefits to that. That's what I'm talking about. Like, it actually caused a spill out into culture of like, we got a bunch of grad students who don't have enough jobs, and we got blogs. Like, and so the disappearance of the public intellectual into academia actually was interestingly kind of undone in recent years by the oversupply of academics. But that really hasn't actually gotten through the other social problems in our society that has classes curtailed from each other, et cetera, and so forth. And no, I don't think everyone has to learn how to speak all this jargon. But there are things that I did learn in grad school that I try to teach to like everyday people, because it really does help them to know how to, I don't know, read for bias or understand what a claim really is doing, or figure out what the most important information is in any given text, so you don't waste a whole lot of time on the parts of it that aren't. Those kinds of things are the kinds of things I perfected in grad school, and they do help people, and they can be taught to people in public. And I think, there are ways that we have to think about doing that, but it's going to have to be part of a larger social project. And I guess that's my big push is, I think for me, you and I have basically a little bit talked about our class backgrounds before off air. But I really was sold academia as like the one place in American life where there still kind of was meritocracy. And thus it was a way that like somebody from a intermediate background, whether that be class or racial or whatever, could actually like take advantage of that. And that ain't true, really. completely not true, but I would say it's like 80% false to add a meaningless statistic to it. Um, and I think there's a whole lot of people who are in that situation, particularly right now. I guess that my final note is we all know that there's a reckoning coming down the pipeline for academia, no matter what, like because their student base is going to drop significantly, and it seems like the idea of just replacing that with immigrant students is becoming unpalatable politically for whatever reason.
I mean, I'll just say the business model when I started graduate school in 2019 at the UC was to explicitly recruit Chinese nationals as students to pay out of state tuition.
Yep.
And that just is not going to happen anymore. I mean, because of the geopolitical stuff, so there, like you said, I mean, there is that part of this too, which is like, it as a business model, as a business model, right? As an experience, is going to keep going through shifts that I think will continue to erode, particularly in the humanities, any residual semblance of what the intellectual project of the humanities is. And I honestly think there are ways in which that is, of course, very bad and harmful for the people that sit within those projects.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are ways in which that the facade is actually quite socially harmful in a lot of different ways, and not for the ways that any conservative would say. And I think it's because it colors the critical in this gloss of untruth. And I think that's a problem for a critical politics. And I'm not particularly hopeful about a broader social project in America for a lot of reasons. But I do think if there is going to be one, it is going to be as a result of something like a kind of a pretty deep uprooting of some of the ways that these institutions have been operating. And I don't see that as an accelerationist view, because I actually don't want that to happen. But I think there are a lot of ways in which it probably will.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add to that, because I think I've been on that warpath for a while. When I was working in the universities abroad, there was this whole academic complex. It was just getting foreign students into the U.S. so they would pay more tuition. And I actually remember a couple times like sitting down and trying to talk people out of it. Like, maybe you can, I don't know, you could stay here, go to Europe or someplace cheaper. But nonetheless, it is what it is. But that's over. It really is over. There are some other attempts at the major universities to try to get out of it, like Ivy League's opening satellite campuses with slightly different acceptance standards in places like Dubai.
NYU Dubai or things like that.
Yeah, but and I knew people used to work in that world. So for people who want to know how I got my world traveling in, that was how I'd have I can't afford this shit. I can't, I don't come from money. I had to have academics pay for it. But I could see the writing on the wall even 10 years ago that this was going to hit some real geopolitical problems, and that it wasn't possible forever, because eventually the people are going to just go to institutions in their home country now they got the education here. Mm-hmm. No matter, even if there wasn't the geopolitical decoupling. And
I suppose one might imagine if one buys into this whole new Cold War with China structure is a reinvigoration of the Cold War university. I know, I don't know, maybe talking with someone like Daniel Besner about something like that would be interesting. But I, other than something like that, I mean, I think it's, I mean, of course, thinking into the future is always difficult, but it seems difficult for me to imagine um, a way to understand how the humanities continues to go forward along the terms of this business model and not continue to hemorrhage its funding sources. It's tough. It's a tough one.
Yeah, it's tough. Um, and to, I guess, make one more point about labor, it's also hard for me to see how I think these labor disputes are important, and I think they can make provisional winnings. But you said, as you said, there's some fundamental problems here that even the unionization of this labor isn't going to fix.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there is, and there are some really structural pernicious things that are outside of the university too. Like,
Mm-hmm.
If you're a union bureaucrat, and I know leftists aren't supposed to throw this word around, but they do exist, and you have a steady supply of temporary union members who, however, are not going to develop a whole lot of skill and expertise as rank and file in the 5 years that they're going to be in that union, because that's the max they could possibly be in it. It's kind of a good income stream, but it doesn't require a lot of work, because like they're not going to be there forever.
Mm-hmm.
And so like your investment in that is kind of is kind of its own thing. Lastly, someone's saying the Ivies are going to do just fine. The Ivies are endowments with the universities attached to them, not the other way around.
Yeah, it's boutique.
Yeah, like I'm not really worried about the poor Ivies collapsing, but I am worried about the poor state schools collapsing if they're not just just turning into what they kind of are becoming in some places, like in the South, where they're just massive landlords, like,
or like explicitly politicized, like in Florida with the new college, which is like 2 hours down the road from where I am right now. So there's threats in multiple angles, to these universities. And
oh yeah,
and yeah, I mean, a lot of airway of time has been spent talking about how universities, like you said, are just landlords, or like the material economic kind of base or endowments. But I think it does need to be said as well, like, right, what one commenter is saying, right, feudal patronage system. There's a way in which there's almost like a realignment of what the university is at the moment, alongside some of these economic structures that to me it speaks to an interesting kind of politicization of society writ large, in ways that I think maybe could be talked about, but not in the like Republican or Democrat sense, but in the sense of like a more explicit understanding of the way the world is working being kind of put front and center.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to think about. Oh, I guess when I think about this, I come to this point of like, we do need to have a bit of complexity in how this exists, because all these, as you said earlier, all these things exist as tendencies in the same institution.
Mm-hmm.
Like, from the most cynical to the most ideal, like there are real pockets of these idealistic things that we are talking about that do really exist in the
Mm-hmm.
university. Probably pretty minor, but like I encountered them. Like, they're not, and not every actor is cynical.
Of
Like,
course not. Yeah.
right.
That's
So
that's what's kind of heartbreaking about it too, right? Like at times where
yeah,
right, like there are many people who mean very well, and then have to encounter these structures in particular ways that are very difficult and require, unfortunately, at times, like you know, I mean, like say some of my mentors and advisors during the strike would give lip service to the strike and then, you know, cross the picket line and do our work for us and things like that. And these are people who are imagined as critical intellectuals, right? And people have said this all the time. I mean, there's tons of stories um, from Judith Butler giving money to Kamala Harris to, you know, things that I think come from structure, like people who do mean well. That's not necessarily a personal attack on Butler at all. I deeply respect their work, but there are structural limits to our capacity as actors within systems that that go way deeper historically and at grander scale than our individual agency can allow for. And so that's just what happens, right? When you throw people into a system and a structure that produces these very confused and perverse contradictory incentives and impulses and punishments as well.
Yeah. One last thing I'm going to address is one of the questions in the chat, which is, could at least part of the collapse be prevented by slimming down the university administration? And I would say temporarily, maybe, but I'm going to actually say a lot of that university administration exists for a reason, other than its own self-perpetuation. Like I've never been a believer in the Graeber bullshit jobs thesis, because usually when we get rid of those jobs, we discover that there is a reason why they were there. The reasons for a lot of the university administration is frankly legal.
Right. Well, it's legal. And then I think another thing I would add is I mean, if we're going to say it's a medieval institution, it has to be that way, right? Like the structure of facilitating the different funding sources up the chain of mediation requires an immense bureaucracy. And that's something that, yeah, I mean, you know, maybe you could shift around who gets paid what, obviously, right? And you could trim things here and there, but again, it comes back down to a question of like, what is the university? What actually is it doing? Rather than, well, what if we just chop off this arm and see what happens?
Yeah, this arm that we all hate, but we forget that the arm might be there for a reason, even if it's choking us. Like, I tend to this. I for the same reasons, I tend to think we have to look at what the university does, and you know, I'm going to echo something you've strongly implied, is that there isn't anybody in the system, and I don't just mean by this by academics, like people funding it, the states who are procuring this, the endowments, etc., who really have a strong incentive to look at all of what a university is doing, all of its social functions, and that makes it a very unwieldy thing to reform or to fix. I don't blame anyone for leaving it, but I also don't blame people for staying, and that's kind of like, I mean, for if nothing else, as a person who's changed careers 4 or 5 times, there is eventual sunk cost. You just like, it's real hard to get out of the sunk cost.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think I tend to think that people shouldn't be blamed for very much. I mean, I think there's always reasons why people make the decisions that they do, and that can be tricky to play that game. You know, it becomes often a mise en abîme where you lose the thread pretty quickly. And I just want to answer Colin's question in the chat. Actually, we talked about. I think we cited you, Colin, on your and Varn's conversation about the university having a kind of legacy medieval structure to it. It's certainly more complicated than just asserting that outright.
Yeah, it's to call it a medieval institution is to maybe give it too much credit.
Yeah, I agree.
It's also a Cold War institution. It's a neoliberal institution. And I will say this, university life, for reasons that I don't entirely understand, seems to be recuperatable in ways and restructurable in ways that other kinds of institutions have a hard time being. But so, anything we say about it, whether it's the legacy medieval university to, the neoliberal university, it's like, partly true. Like, but yeah. Thank you so much for coming on today. You give me about 2 hours of your time, and it's a lot. I'm glad we had this conversation. And just so you guys know, part of the reason why this exists is not just for me to advocate for a political position, because like I'm not a member of any political group. I am a Marxist analyst. I'm a Marxist advocate, but like I'm not a member of a Marxist party. Fuck, I don't even join the DSA. I am in a union, but that has nothing to do with what I do here. This contradiction of academia and the audience problem has been on my mind for like 15 years, where I'm like, I have skills. I want the good parts of these skills to be spread around, and there weirdly are means to do it, even if they're shitty and capitalist or whatever. But they're free or semi-free for the loser, or at least way cheaper than a degree. But then you do come up with some of the other functions of the university, like, yes, I can educate you, but that's not going to get you a credential that's going to help you get a job. So, there are other parts of this that I want people to look at. But one of the reasons why I'm having this conversation is like answering some of the problems that come up in this is part of why I do this, is because I'm like, oh yeah, there's stuff that's life-changing that you can learn from some of the scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a lot of bullshit, but you can't have one without the other, honestly.
Yeah, that's life, I think.
Yeah, like we're not gonna get the good stuff if we don't have to wade through some crap. And so on that note, I want people to just think about that and think about maybe the social conditions that we should be advocating for that would enable the people who need it. And again, I don't think everybody needs to be an academic, my God, but
please don't.
Yeah. But for the people who need it, or more importantly, the people who want it and could benefit from it, for it to be available to them in some ways, even though I have no delusions about replicating all the social functions of a university.
Yeah. And I'll say two things. One, if you want a 5-year contracted job at a wage that's pretty stable, if that's what it is to you, it's not a bad choice going to grad school.
Yeah.
I think that should be said, and it's important that is said. And then to your point, Varn, about having conversations like this, I just wanted to say, like, I appreciate the fact that you've always been open to having a genuine conversation about things with people who aren't necessarily linked up to the particular status games of, dare I say, just like kind of all of the attention economy, including academia. And that's something that it's hard to find. And I really appreciate that personally for the conversations that we've had over the years, but also just for listeners as well. So thank you.
Thank you. It's the other part of the mission, is finding people who I think would be interesting regardless of whether or not anyone would care.
Yeah.
Like, it's just so I could do the easy route, and this is not to slight him. I actually am quite fond of him. I could have Matt Christman on every day, and I guarantee you this would be bigger. But I don't think people would learn as much from it.
Yeah, no, I mean, trust me, I had a podcast where we fought with him, and it generated a lot of numbers. But I think an honest conversation like this, honestly, does more teaching and is more insightful than that. Which is no slight on him. I actually find him kind of insightful nowadays. But
yeah, me too. I like Christman. But yeah. Also, people should go back and listen to that interview you guys did with him on Superstructure, because I listening to it, it wasn't a matter of who won. It was like, who actually understands what the other person means. And I got by the end of it that both of you kind of did a little more But it was an exercise in like your assumptions about what political is or isn't were completely different. And interestingly, just as an outside person who's listened to both of you and talked to you now for 2 or 3 years, you're closer to each other now than you were when you had that conversation.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that, which I think is, it's kind of beautiful in a way. I think it's one of those things that's how life goes sometimes. And I think there are ways in which a kind of, hopefully, I mean, dare I say, like a consensus around this kind of like materialistically inflected Keynesianism can, with touches of Freud, can be something that people can dip in and out of in ways that don't feel too theoretically charged or sectarian. But that might be a more hopeful gesture on my part. But anyway,
maybe it could happen. I hope so. But on that note, thank you so much. Have a good evening. I would ask you if you have anything to promote, but we were talking off air. I guess, do you have anything to promote these days, or do you just
no,
you're just
not
free?
really. If you want to follow me on Twitter, you could, I don't know, see my tweets. Sometimes I say things that are funny, sometimes insightful. But yeah, you know, if you
I
want to
do
talk to
enjoy
me,
your
you know where to
Twitter,
find me.
but I will also say its tenor's changed in the last year. So
yeah, certainly it has.
All right. Well, have a great day.
Thanks.